to another video. We are officially 1 month away from the Costube Symposium, aka Cozy, which is the weekend of August 19th through the 22nd. And I'm going to start today by giving you the official rundown on my live event. I'm hosting a pocket along. What is that? I'm glad you asked. So I know that many of you are going to want to have some hand sewing to do while you're watching all of the awesome content that Costube has coming your way. On my website, www.creativesarah.ca, there is a tab called Patterns, and on it you will find a very simple pattern for an 18th century pocket. It's printable, it'll come out on one piece of paper so you don't have to tape it together, and I'll go over all the instructions during a live, and that'll get you set up with a project that's pretty easy to do during the cozy weekend. All you need is 2 pieces of fabric, some twill tape, and or bias tape. So you guys get all that ready, and we'll have a quick and easy project to hand sew. While I'm on the subject, remember to like and subscribe this video because it really helps me out in the enormous YouTube algorithm. With all of that out of the way, let's get started on today's video. Quick side note, it is like 30 degrees Celsius here where I am, and I have to turn most of the fans and air conditioners off so you can hear me, and I'm melting, so I apologize for that. So, like many other costubers, I spent a good portion of the beginning of 2021 making myself a Regency dress. In the wake of Bridgerton and the new Emma movie, and with events starting up again, it seemed like a good idea. While I was making this dress and all of the undergarments that go with it, we in Canada have been reminded of the horrors that our ancestors committed. I originally had done some research into slavery in Canada in the Regency period, but because we didn't have large plantation farms and therefore didn't need the same kind of workforce, essentially slavery fell out of fashion rather than being something that there was a large public outcry about and was officially abolished in that way. So instead, I decided to look into what was happening with relations with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and oh boy. This is where I'm going to add in some content warnings for kind of anti-insensitive and racist language, used only in the context of direct source quotations. And of course, this all leads into the beginning of a cultural genocide that occurred here in Canada. And if you aren't in the place to hear about that today, then feel free to click out and I will see you again in another video. So, here's the plan for today. I'm going to talk about the relationship between the British Crown and the Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia during the 18th and early 19th century, while I show you clips of my sewing. Regency construction is pretty straightforward, and I hand-stitched a lot of the dress while stuck in bed with a sprained ankle, so there isn't actually a whole lot of footage of that because I couldn't reach my camera. I will have all the patterns listed in the description box. Historical rant, here we go. Okay. So here's the context. The Mi'kmaq people, and Mi'kma'ki, or the land of the Mi'kmaq, is Eastern Canada. My focus will primarily be Nova Scotia because that's where I live, but those boundaries weren't always in existence, so be aware that sometimes that's going to affect the story that I'm telling you. At the beginning of the 18th century, the Mi'kmaq were allied with the Wabanaki Confederation, which included 4 other Algonquin language nations: Abenaki, Pobnescot, Passamaquoddy, and Maliseet. And the Wabanaki Confederation was allied with the Acadians, who are the French settlers in the Maritimes. The goal of this alliance was to keep the British from taking over the region. Over the next 75 years, there would be many wars fought in the land of Mi'kma'ki. The wars are now known as the 4 French and Indian Wars, and Father Rail's War and Father Le Lut's War. Despite the fact that these wars would rage until the middle of the 1700s, France lost military control of what will become Nova Scotia in 1710, and lost legal rights to all of it except for KalkBrakken in 1713 in the Treaty of Utrecht, which was involved with the war for Spanish succession because world politics, I guess? What is important to note here is that the Mi'kmaq never conceded land to the British. In 1715, they were simply told that the British now held their homeland. This was understandably upsetting. They complained to the French commander at the fortress of Louisbourg because the French king had essentially given away something he didn't own. They were informed that according to the European powers that be, a non-Christian could not legally own land. Apparently, the fact that they had the land first didn't matter, because European colonists understand sharing worse than 3-year-olds. Mi'kmaq historian Daniel Paul observes that if this warped law were ever to be accorded recognition by modern legalists, they would have to take into consideration that after Grand Chief Membertou and his family converted to Christianity in 1610, the land of Mi'kmaq had become exempt from being seized because the people were Christians. However, it's hard to imagine that a modern government would fall back and try to use such uncivilized garbage as justification for non-recognition of Aboriginal title." End quote. So, that left the Mi'kmaq in an awful place. They had not given their land away, but they also didn't have legal rights to it according to the rest of the people living there. In 1726, they signed a treaty, sometimes called the Mascarenes Treaty. The Indigenous peoples agreed to cease hostilities against Britain, and in exchange, the British promised not to interfere with Indigenous hunting, fishing, and farming. This treaty largely kept the peace, aside from a few raids, until the outbreak of hostilities between the Mi'kmaq and the British during the late 1740s. What was there to do? Team up with the other people in the same position. The Acadians in what is now mainland Nova Scotia were in a very similar position to the Mi'kmaq. They had worked hard to build farms and homes on what was now British territory. It is important to note here that the Acadians were and are a distinct group from New France, or what would become Quebec. They had their own culture and dialect of language. This was the state of things from 1713 to the expulsion of the Acadians during the end phase of the Anglo-Mi'kmaq War, which ran from 1749 to 1760. Supported by Acadian and French militiamen, Mi'kmaq fighters carried out military strikes against the British, which would add on to the larger French and Indian War, which ran from 1754 to 1763. 1755 to 1764, the Mi'kmaq and the Acadians ran raids and military attacks on the British settlements, Halifax, Dartmouth, Lunenburg, and Lawrencetown. When the expulsion happened, the Mi'kmaq did what they could to help the Acadians, both with fighting back and helping them to hide. Many Acadians in the Maritimes today have Mi'kmaq blood, a result of many years of cooperation. And if you'd like me to do a separate video about the history of the Acadians in my region, I can for sure do that. Just let me know in the comments. After the expulsion, though, the British assumed control of what they considered to be their territory. They realized that the Mi'kmaq were likely to continue to be a problem for them, understandably, because it's their land. This led to a few treaties between the Crown and the Mi'kmaq. And since the land of Mi'kma'ki is made of multiple smaller groups, these treaties took time and multiple people all had to agree on them. First of all, there was the 1752 Peace and Friendship Treaty, which is celebrated annually on Treaty Day, October 1st, because we are all treaty people. However, the legality of this treaty is tricky because there was no way to confirm that Jean-Baptiste Cope, who was the person who signed on behalf of the Mi'kmaq, was able to speak for the whole of the Mi'kmaq people. As opposed to just the Shubenacadie Mi'kmaq, which is the group that he was in charge of or led. Instead, the end of hostilities came with the Halifax Treaties, signed in 1760, after France lost Quebec and many of its other key holdings in the New World to the British. The Halifax Treaties with the Mi'kmaq did not renew earlier treaties that were negotiated between the Mi'kmaq and the British, which was unusual for the time. One historian has argued that for many Mi'kmaq communities, they had never subscribed to the earlier Nova Scotia Treaty, the one from 1726, so there was thus nothing to be renewed. However, others have pointed out continuity between the 1726 treaty and those signed in both 1760 and 1761, notably that the first 6 articles of the Halifax Treaties correspond with the first 6 articles of the 1726 treaty, with a few modifications. As such, it seems that the British and the Mi'kmaq considered the 1726 treaty to form the basis of their relationship, or at least the kind of legal basis for it all. That's kind of confusing. So basically, what it's saying is that the 1726 treaty is suspicious, but legally it seems to be where the relationship between the British Crown and the Mi'kmaq people started, so that's what we're going with. It may also seem a bit strange that the Mi'kmaq had a treaty with the British while they were actively fighting against them, but I have to ask you, if strangers were trying to take over your home, what would you do to protect it? The 1760 treaty, among other things, promises that all previous actions between the government of Great Britain and the government of Mi'kma'ki are finished, and it uses the phrase buried like the hatchet, which was apparently a practice widely used and was followed in 1761 by a ceremony where a literal hatchet was buried. I also find it highly suspicious that the government of Great Britain wanted to mark an end to all hostilities, which meant they took no responsibility for anything that happened before that. Additionally, the treaty promises that the Mi'kmaq people can hunt and fish freely and sell their profits if they want to. It also entitles them to a quantity of bread, flour, and other provisions to be supplied by the Crown, in addition to gifts of blankets and tobacco and some powder and shot. It also asks that they work as ambassadors with other First Nations people, that they help shipwrecked travelers, and it promises them that they have all the rights of British citizens. With this peace established, things once again got heated when the colonies of the United States attempted to recruit the Mi'kmaq to fight against the British during the invasion of Canada and the Revolutionary War. The British immediately reached out to renew friendship, and the Mi'kmaq maintained their allegiance to the British Crown, signing renewed treaties in 1778 and 1779. So, at the end of the 18th century, once the American Revolution had settled down, the British kind of decided that they didn't have to cater to the Indigenous population anymore, as they were undisputed masters of what would later become Canada. So all those good things that had been put in the treaties, they kind of started to ignore them. Additionally, the bit about the rights of British citizens had never really materialized, which I'm sure we're all completely shocked about. The Mi'kmaq only had about 300 fighters when the Halifax Treaties were signed, as compared to thousands of British soldiers. In his 2003 book about the British expulsion of the Acadians, University of Cincinnati history professor Jeffrey Plank described the relationship between the Mi'kmaq and Acadians as strong. The Mi'kmaq believed they could share their traditional lands with both the British and the Acadians, with the Mi'kmaq hunting as usual and getting to the coast for seafood. There is, however, a lot of debate between historians about how the Mi'kmaq intended those treaties to be held up. Historian Stephen Patterson indicates that the Halifax Treaties established a lasting peace on the basis that the Mi'kmaq surrendered and chose to uphold the rule of law through the British courts rather than resorting to violence. Patterson argues that the Mi'kmaq were not in a position of military strength after the defeat of the French, which is what I just said, and he argues that without a supply of guns and ammunition, the Mi'kmaq lost their ability to fight and to hunt for food. As a result, the British were able to define themselves the terms of the treaties. Patterson identifies the Halifax Treaties as defining the relationship between the Mi'kmaq and the British. While the treaties do not stipulate the laws governing land and resources, the treaties ensured that both parties would follow the laws that would eventually be made to deal with these matters and any other matters that came up. The British accepted a continuing role for existing Mi'kmaq policies within the limits of British sovereignty. To me, this is an awfully rosy view of things. I have my doubts that the British as a whole intended to be so understanding and generous with a people they barely considered to be human. On the other hand, historian John G. Reed dismisses the treaty's language about the Mi'kmaq submission to the British Crown. He believes that the Mi'kmaq intended a friendly and reciprocal relationship. He asserts his interpretation is based on what is known of the surrounding discussions, combined with the strong evidence of later Mi'kmaq statements. The Mi'kmaq leaders who represented their people in the Halifax negotiations in 1760 had clear goals: to make peace, establish secure and well-regulated trade in commodities such as furs, and to begin an ongoing friendship with the British Crown. In return, they offered their own friendship and a tolerance of limited British settlement, although without any formal land surrender. To fulfill the reciprocity intended by the Mi'kmaq, Reed argues that any additional British settlement of land would have to be negotiated and accompanied by giving presents to the Mi'kmaq. There was a long history of Europeans giving Mi'kmaq people presents to be accommodated on their land, starting with their very first colonial contacts. The document summarizing the peace agreements failed to establish specific territorial limits on the expansion of British settlements, but assured the Mi'kmaq of access to the natural resources that had long sustained them along the region's coasts and in the forests. Their concepts of land use, of course, between the British and the Mi'kmaq were quite different. Despite the treaties, the British continued to build fortifications in the province, for example, Fort Ellis and Fort Belcher. Additionally, the arrival of British loyalists escaping the newly formed United States led to greater than ever numbers of colonists taking over lands that the Mi'kmaq used for hunting. The stress on resources caused mounting problems for the Mi'kmaq in providing for themselves. Without the desire for the Mi'kmaq as military allies in the beginning of the 19th century, the Mi'kmaq people made explicit appeals to the British to honor the treaties and reminded them of their duty to give presents, i.e. rent, to the Mi'kmaq in order to occupy Mi'kma'ki. In response, the British offered charity, or the word most often used by government officials, relief. The British said the Mi'kmaq must give up their way of life and begin to settle on farms. Also, they were told they had to send their children to British schools for education. One of these schools was the Royal Acadian School. Walter Bromley was a British officer who established the Royal Acadian School and supported the Mi'kmaq over the 13 years that he lived in Nova Scotia, specifically in Halifax, from 1813 to 1825. Bromley devoted himself to the service of the Mi'kmaq people. The Mi'kmaq were among the poor of Halifax and in the rural communities. Historian Judith Fingard says that it is his contribution to give public exposure to the plight of the Mi'kmaq which, quote, particularly contributes to his historical significance, end quote. Fingard writes, quote, Bromley's attitude towards the Indians were singularly enlightened for his day. Bromley totally dismissed the idea that native people were naturally inferior, and set out to encourage their material improvement through settlement and agriculture, their talents through education, and their pride through his own study of their languages, end quote. Walter Bromley founded the Royal Acadian School in 1813 and ran it until 1825. The school itself continued on to provide free education, becoming a girls' school in the 1870s. The school was on Argyle Street initially, in a space formerly used by an amateur theater troupe. His school offered education for middle and low-income families, including girls, Black, and immigrant children. The school included Protestants and Catholics. The school was controversial, however, as some of its biggest supporters came from the Nova Scotia elite. However, in my research, I am completely confused as to whether Mi'kmaq children actually attended this school or not, or whether it's just that he supported Mi'kmaq people and ran this school. I cannot tell. 19th century, the Mi'kmaq people were being robbed of lands they thought they had rented out, and the beginning of the assimilation movement was beginning. And that's where I'm going to leave this video today. I like to think that if I had been alive during the times in question, I would have been an exception to the rule of looking down at First Nations people and thinking that they were inferior to myself. But reality is, I probably wouldn't have been, and you probably wouldn't have been either. So, here is the address for the Residential Schools Survivor Fund. I encourage you to look it up, and I encourage you to be an exception today by donating to this incredibly important effort. And with that, I will leave you. I hope to see you all again soon. If not before, I'll see you all on August 19th for Cozy. Bye, friends!